Dylan and Grace had been married for 6 years, embodying the adage that opposites attract. Grace was fiery and impulsive, her passions flaring unpredictably, while Dylan was a man of unshakable calm, his demeanor so composed it often bordered on indifference. Despite his tranquility, Grace's jealousy burned fiercely, baffling Dylan. He prided himself on his punctuality and transparency, always informing her if he was running late, and he expected the same honesty in return. Yet Grace never articulated the roots of her envy, leaving Dylan to suspect it stemmed from her possessive nature. For years, Dylan had broached the topic of starting a family, but Grace continuously evaded or deferred these conversations. He admired her independence and understood her hesitation to be tied down during maternity leave, but as their marriage stretched on, he yearned to take the next step. Life was steady, their bond seemed strong. Why not expand their family? Grace, however, had other priorities. Lately, she had thrown herself into her work, often staying late without giving Dylan prior notice. Her explanations came only after the fact, and though Dylan trusted her implicitly, he couldn't ignore the creeping doubt that work alone wasn't the cause of her tardiness. He chose to suppress his concerns, hoping things would realign with time. One evening after dinner, Grace mentioned an upcoming trip to visit her parents, who needed her assistance with some matters. Dylan, eager to spend quality time with his wife, suggested accompanying her. "Why don't we go together? We haven't traveled anywhere in ages. It'll be nice to combine business with pleasure," he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Grace's response was cool and detached. Pulling away from his touch, she said, "That won't be necessary. I want to go alone." Dylan blinked in surprise but remained calm. He offered to take a day off work to join her, but Grace stood firm, her resolve unyielding. Reluctantly, he let her go, telling himself she might simply need some time to herself. The day after Grace departed, Dylan went grocery shopping after work. While examining cuts of meat, something bright caught his attention. Turning, he spotted Hannah, an old friend of Grace's, pushing a cart overflowing with groceries. She looked startled and a little awkward upon seeing him. "Dylan," she greeted, her voice tinged with surprise as she approached. They exchanged pleasantries, and Hannah naturally assumed Grace was nearby. When Dylan explained she had gone to visit her parents, a shadow passed over Hannah's face. "She didn't tell me she was leaving," Hannah said softly, lowering her gaze. A pensive silence followed, broken only when her expression shifted to one of sudden realization. "Are you busy right now?" she asked, her voice sharp with urgency. "There's a cafe nearby. Care to grab a coffee?" Dylan hesitated, glancing at her full cart. "What about these groceries? Is your husband here to help?" Hannah shook her head, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "No, it's just me. Could you help me carry these? They're heavier than I expected." "Of course," Dylan replied, his innate politeness taking over. He helped her load the bags into her car and accompanied her to her apartment, where she invited him inside for tea. Though hesitant at first, he accepted out of courtesy. Inside, Hannah quickly prepared tea and set out an assortment of snacks. As they chatted, Dylan noticed her demeanor shift. She sat closer than necessary, her laughter lingered, and her gaze carried a wistful intensity. He began to sense a subtle flirtation beneath her words. Then, without warning, she placed a hand on his knee, her touch lingering. Dylan's chest tightened with discomfort. He leaned back slightly, meeting her gaze with firm resolve. "Hannah," he began, his tone gentle but resolute, "I'm married. And you're married too. Let's not cross any lines." Hannah's hand fell away, and her expression softened into a mixture of regret and understanding. The moment passed, and Dylan excused himself soon after, carrying with him the weight of unspoken tensions. As he walked home, he couldn't help but wonder what Grace would think if she knew, and what secrets she might be keeping of her own. Dylan's serious tone seemed to shatter Hannah's composure. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The violent outburst of emotion caught Dylan off guard, leaving him awkwardly uncertain of how to comfort her. Hesitantly, he reached out to stroke her shoulder, but she flinched and pulled away abruptly. Any trace of her earlier flirtation vanished, replaced by a flood of raw vulnerability. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling with regret. I just wanted to get back at Grace." She covered her face again, her sobs intensifying. Dylan froze, bewildered. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Get revenge for what? Hannah looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with anguish. Your wife. She's having an affair with my husband, she whispered. They've disappeared together, leaving both of us in the dark. Her words hit Dylan like a thunderbolt. He stared at her, searching her face for signs of dishonesty, but she appeared utterly sincere. Rising abruptly from his seat, he knocked the table slightly askew, his calm exterior cracking. What are you saying? He demanded, his voice rising. This can't be true. Grace said she was visiting her parents. She hasn't seen them in months. Hannah's eyes narrowed. And why didn't she invite you to go with her? She asked coldly. Think about it, Dylan. Are you really so sure she's with her parents? Dylan's heart raced, his mind reeling. Could it be true? Was Grace deceiving him? His fists clenched as anger surged within him. Normally composed, he now felt as if he were on the verge of boiling over. Yet he needed proof before jumping to conclusions. Are you absolutely certain? He asked, his voice tight. If you still have doubts, call her, Hannah challenged. And I'll call my husband. Let's find out. Dylan hesitated for a moment before pulling out his phone. His hands shook slightly as he dialed Grace's number, the ringing echoing in his ears like a ticking bomb. Each second felt like an eternity until finally, she answered. Hi, Grace said casually, her tone calm and collected. Are you home? Yeah, Dylan replied, straining to keep his voice steady. Why? Is something wrong? Meanwhile, Hannah dialed her husband's number. The sound of a ringing phone filled the room, but it wasn't coming from her end. Dylan's blood ran cold as he realized the sound was coming from his own phone. Hannah quickly muted her call and leaned toward the receiver, her voice laced with venom. Have a nice time with Nathan, she spat before hanging up. She turned to Dylan, her expression a mix of triumph and sorrow. See? I told you. Dylan stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. Where are they now? He demanded. At my mother-in-law's apartment, Hannah replied bitterly. Get your coat, Dylan said firmly. You're coming with me. By the time Grace returned the next day, Dylan was waiting for her at the door, his expression unreadable. She tried to step inside, but he blocked her path. Let me in, Grace said, her irritation clear. Dylan didn't move. I know where you've been, he said coldly. Grace's face paled, her defenses rising. I told you I was at my parents' house. Before she could continue, a woman's voice called out from behind Dylan. Grace, darling, won't you join us for coffee? Grace's eyes widened in shock as Hannah stepped into view, clad in a short silk robe, her smile full of mischief. The sight was too much for Grace to process, and her face contorted with rage and disbelief. Hannah's next words were vulgar, laced with enough venom to make even a hardened sailor blush. Dylan, however, remained calm, his lips curling into a smirk. Don't come back here, he said to Grace, his tone final. He slammed the door in her face, leaving her seething on the other side. Over the next few days, Dylan packed all of Grace's belongings and sent them to Nathan's apartment. His marriage was over, but in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected blossomed, his connection with Hannah. Initially united by shared pain, their bond deepened as they spent more time together. To their surprise, they discovered they were remarkably compatible. They supported each other through the painful process of divorcing their respective spouses, and before long, they began building a life together. Grace, meanwhile, moved in with Nathan. But her bitterness and jealousy followed her like a storm cloud. She grew increasingly possessive, berating Nathan whenever he was late or distant. Their arguments escalated, draining whatever passion had once existed between them. Eventually, their relationship crumbled under the weight of Grace's insecurities. While Grace was left to wallow in resentment, Dylan and Hannah found happiness in each other's company. What began as a painful betrayal became the foundation for a new and unexpected chapter in their lives.